Well, tensions continue to brew between China and Taiwan, and in the latest, Taipei flagged off a Chinese research ship sailing in sensitive waters to the island's west.
On the 21st of February, a container ship approached a berth at Qingdao and did something that sounded impossible. Nobody was steering it. It navigated the final approach, positioned itself beside the quay, and suction pads reached out from the dock and locked the vessel in place in under 30 seconds. No ropes, no line handlers, no tugboats. Then automated cranes began removing containers while driverless vehicles carried them into the yard. From the moment the ship approached the port to the moment its cargo began moving, not one human being physically touched the operation. And this was not a prototype. The vessel has been in commercial service since 2022, has completed hundreds of voyages, and operates using batteries and automated systems. But that ship is only one part of something much bigger. Chinese engineers are simultaneously working on nuclear-powered container ships, methanol-fueled vessels, floating nuclear power and fuel stations, and increasingly automated ports. Behind all of it is an industrial base so large that one Chinese shipyard has been described as having more construction capacity than the entire American shipbuilding industry. So this is not really a story about ships. It is a story about what happens when one country accumulates so much industrial capacity that it begins influencing what the future of an entire industry looks like. To understand why that matters, remember how important shipping actually is. Around 80 to 90% of everything people own has crossed an ocean on a ship. Phones, laptops, furniture, car components, food, fertilizer. Shipping is the circulatory system of the global economy. When the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal in 2021, roughly $9 billion of trade a day was disrupted, and suddenly the world remembered how dependent it is on these enormous steel vessels. For decades, the basic formula barely changed. Ships burned heavy fuel oil in enormous diesel engines. The engines were incredibly efficient and reliable, but the fuel was also extremely dirty. Shipping produces roughly 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions and historically produced huge amounts of sulfur pollution. For years, there was little reason to change. The engines worked, the fuel was cheap, ports were built around it, crews knew how to operate it, and the entire industry was designed around the system. Then, regulation changed the equation. The International Maritime Organization introduced decarbonization targets, while Europe began putting shipping under carbon pricing. The problem is that a ship ordered today can take years to build and then remain in service for 25 or 30 years. That means ship owners are being asked to predict which fuel will be available, affordable, and politically acceptable decades into the future. The industry initially looked toward methanol. It was attractive because it could be stored and handled similarly to liquid fuels while producing much less soot and particulate pollution. Orders surged. In 2024, DNV recorded 149 methanol-fueled vessel orders, but by 2025, that number had fallen to just 61. And in the first half of 2026, Clarksons recorded only 4 methanol-fueled vessel orders worldwide. The problem was not the engines. The problem was supply. Most methanol is still produced from fossil sources, while genuinely green methanol remains scarce and expensive. Ammonia and hydrogen have struggled even more. Ammonia produces no carbon during combustion, but it is toxic, corrosive, and difficult to burn safely. Hydrogen faces its own storage and infrastructure challenges, so ship owners increasingly turn toward LNG. In the first half of 2026, there were 173 LNG-fueled vessel orders. LNG is cleaner than heavy fuel oil, and the infrastructure already exists. But it is still a fossil fuel. It is a bridge, not necessarily the final destination, and that uncertainty is creating an opening for something the shipping industry tried decades ago and largely abandoned: nuclear power. Nuclear merchant shipping is not new. The United States built the Savannah, Germany built the Otto Hahn, Japan built the Mutsu. All three technically worked, but commercially they failed. They were expensive, ports rejected them, specialized crews were required, insurance was complicated, and political resistance was enormous. The technology was not the only problem, the entire system around it was. But the nuclear technology now being discussed is different. Chinese shipbuilders have proposed container ships using molten salt reactors. Instead of keeping water under enormous pressure, a molten salt reactor uses liquid salt as both fuel and coolant. That means it can operate at much lower pressure. The fuel is already molten, and if the salt escapes containment, it can cool and solidify rather than behaving like a conventional high-pressure reactor system. The reactor can also be shut down by draining the fuel salt into tanks where sustained fission cannot continue. The proposed designs use thorium. Thorium is more abundant than uranium, and its fuel cycle offers potential advantages involving fuel supply and proliferation. One of the most significant proposals came from Jiangnan Shipyard, part of China State Shipbuilding Corporation. The design is a 24,000 TEU container ship powered by a thorium molten salt reactor. DNV issued an approval in principle for the concept. A later project describes a reactor of around 200 megawatts with an operational lifespan of roughly 40 years, with a smaller 14,000 TEU version also being developed. If such a vessel ever becomes practical, the implications would be enormous. A nuclear container ship could potentially operate for decades without conventional refueling. That means no repeated bunkering stops and far less exposure to fuel price volatility. It could also maintain high speeds without the fuel penalty that has forced conventional ships to slow down, and this is no longer purely theoretical research. In November 2025, the Chinese Academy of Sciences announced that it had achieved thorium to uranium fuel conversion inside a 2-megawatt liquid-fueled thorium molten salt reactor. That reactor is tiny compared with a commercial ship, but it represents an important step from drawings toward a physical demonstration. China has even proposed something more ambitious, a floating nuclear island that could function as a container transfer terminal, an energy hub, and a fuel production station. Ships could potentially transfer cargo offshore while the platform generates electricity and produces fuel. It sounds futuristic, but it follows the same logic behind China's other experiment, automation. Remember the autonomous vessel at Qingdao. The ship is roughly 110 to 117 meters long and can carry around 300 containers. It entered service in 2022 as part of a national intelligent navigation research program. It uses batteries and generator sets through an electric propulsion system, and it can operate in 3 modes, with a crew, remotely controlled from shore, or fully autonomously. In one recent year, it completed 353 voyages and moved more than 80,000 containers while operating with roughly 30% fewer crew than a comparable conventional feeder. Then came the February demonstration. The ship navigated into port autonomously. It berthed itself. Vacuum mooring secured it in 30 seconds. Automated cranes unloaded the containers. Driverless vehicles transported them through the terminal. The ship communicated with the terminal, and the terminal coordinated the entire operation. That is more important than simply having an unmanned ship. It is an autonomous logistics chain, and the technology has already been applied across multiple Chinese vessels and port organizations. The economic reason for pursuing this is obvious. Crew shortages, labor costs, and human error are major problems in shipping. A shore-based control center can potentially supervise several vessels simultaneously. The logical path is to begin with short, repetitive feeder routes, prove the technology, and gradually expand it. But none of these technologies would matter as much without China's most important advantage: scale. In 2025, Chinese shipyards captured roughly 63% of global new shipbuilding orders by compensated tonnage. In the first half of 2026, Chinese yards took around 72% of global new vessel orders. South Korea remained the closest competitor, while Japan's share fell dramatically. Chinese shipbuilding output was also rising rapidly, and more than 80% of China's new international orders in early 2026 were for vessels using greener technologies or alternative propulsion systems. This dominance did not come from one invention. It came from decades of industrial accumulation, state support, preferential financing, domestic steel, a huge skilled workforce, large supply chains, an enormous production volume. And volume creates another advantage. The more ships a country builds, the better its yards become at building ships. The strategic consequences are difficult to ignore. Chinese commercial shipbuilding capacity is vastly larger than that of the United States, and commercial and military shipbuilding share many of the same industrial foundations, the same dry docks, the same engineers, the same welders, the same suppliers, the same design infrastructure. That does not automatically mean China has superior naval technology. The United States still maintains major advantages in areas such as aircraft carriers, submarines, sensors, and decades of operational experience. But industrial capacity matters. A country capable of building enormous numbers of commercial vessels also possesses a huge industrial base that can support naval construction and repair. That is why a story about container ships eventually becomes a story about national security. But there are serious limits to everything we have discussed. The nuclear container ship does not exist yet. There is a design and approval in principle and a small land-based reactor that has demonstrated thorium-related processes. The gap between that and a commercial nuclear ship remains enormous. Ports would have to accept nuclear vessels, insurance and international liability would have to be resolved, crews would require specialized training, and molten salt reactors still face difficult engineering problems, including corrosion over extremely long operating periods. Autonomous shipping faces its own regulatory barriers. International maritime rules were largely written around the assumption that a crew is physically aboard the ship. A small autonomous feeder operating between two nearby ports is one thing. An unmanned vessel crossing the Pacific through storms, heavy traffic, and multiple jurisdictions is something entirely different. And even the fuel transition is not settled. LNG may dominate today, but green methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, or another technology could still gain ground if supply and infrastructure improve. So individually, any of these Chinese projects could fail. The nuclear ship might never sail. The floating nuclear island might remain a concept. Autonomous vessels could face years of regulation. But collectively, something has already changed. While much of the global industry is waiting for certainty, China is testing multiple possibilities at the same time. Nuclear, autonomy, alternative fuels, and massive production. That means China is learning while everyone else is still deciding. And that may be the most important point in the entire story. Almost none of this technology is uniquely Chinese. Molten salt reactor research existed in American laboratories decades ago. Autonomous navigation is based on technologies developed around the world. Methanol and ammonia engines were developed largely by established international manufacturers. Nuclear merchant ships were already demonstrated more than half a century ago. The difference is not necessarily who invented the technology, it is who still has the industrial base capable of building it at scale. Industrial capability takes decades to create. Dry docks, cranes, engineers, welders, suppliers, factories, and institutional knowledge. Once that ecosystem disappears, rebuilding it is extremely difficult. That is what happened in the United States, where commercial shipbuilding capacity declined dramatically after decades of changing economics and policy. The capability did not disappear because America forgot how to build ships. It disappeared because the industrial system supporting them was gradually allowed to shrink. And that brings us back to the question, will China's new ships change everything? The honest answer is that we do not know. The thorium ship might never sail. The floating nuclear island might never leave the drawing board. Autonomous shipping might take another decade to overcome regulation, but something has already changed. The question of what a ship should be, how it should be powered, whether it needs a crew, and even where the port should physically exist, is now being actively tested at enormous scale in China. And whoever answers those questions first may not simply build the next generation of ships. They may build the reactors, supply the components, train the workforce, develop the standards, and define the technologies everyone else eventually has to follow. The ships moving the world's cargo 30 years from now will almost certainly look different from today's. What is far less uncertain is who is spending the next decade learning how to build them. If you made it this far, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next one reaches you. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Would you be comfortable with a nuclear-powered container ship carrying your country's cargo and docking in your nearest port? Or is that a line you would rather the shipping industry did not cross? Tell me where you land and why. I read every single one.